With the upcoming third and final movie, Fate Stay Night Heaven's Feel Spring Song, I want to give some of my thoughts on the first two movies as well as give my hopes for the third film. As a warning, I will be spoiling the events of the first two movies and the visual novel up to that point. This will include the many things that the anime has left out. I will give another warning when I go over the contents of what will be in the third movie. I loved the start of the first movie. The slow and melancholic tone was an amazing setup for the rest of the story. The atmosphere let us know that this is going to be completely different from the previous installment, Unlimited Blade Works. Focusing on the relationship between Sakura and Shiro was well done and established the main focus of this route. I found the pacing of the story very enjoyable. It didn't waste time re-explaining the information we knew from the previous two series. While it did help, the time they made for themselves wasn't enough. The story of Heaven's Feel in the visual novel is about 20 to 24 hours, while the movies will only add up to 6. As you can tell, many scenes that develop the story and its characters were cut. While it is sad to see many of the scenes I was looking forward to were skipped over, it was necessary for the story to be coherent and not seem all over the place. Some characters have a lot less relevance in the story than they did in the visual novel. For example, Ilya and Kotomine. A lot of the time in the movies, Ilya felt as if she was just there instead of helping to progress the story. Kire is the same way. We don't see his reactions to the events, which ends up developing his character. Other explanations and moments that could have been better or are left out include the explanation about Zoken's ability of revival, which may be included in the third movie. One aspect that could have been better was to show more emphasis on Shiro's loss of Saber. It only touches on that aspect very shortly, and I believe it could have had more of an impact if done differently. Last thing I will touch on is the mystery of the shadow. With how long these segments would be, there is no surprise these were taken out. In the visual novel, almost every night, you would go out and investigate different parts of the town in hopes to find the shadow and stop the harm it intends to do. Sadly, in the anime, you don't get to experience 90% of it. There's only one investigation scene and the rest are either implied or don't happen at all. I was most disappointed by the exclusion of the scenes where you are put in the perspective of the shadow. In the visual novel, occasionally, you will not be put in the perspective of Shiro, but in the perspective of the shadow. Even though these had to be left out, these moments play a major role in the story and world building. While there are many things that had to be left out because of time constraints, there are many moments that I think the anime did better than the original visual novel. The dark atmosphere the anime gives off is done beautifully. The combination of the art style, animation, and soundtrack is absolutely stunning, greatly enhancing the experience. I think Sakura's reveal was done masterfully. From the beginning, we don't see any similarities. We have very few things alluding to what the shadow is. But from the second movie, we see a lot more concerning things. After Sakura's yandere freakout in the bathroom, there's a very questionable thing lurking in the shadows. Later on, when Shiro notices something very suspicious, his inner monologue tells a lot about his feelings and character. Then, one of my favorite moments in anime is Sakura in Wonderland. The innocent setting is very jarring and a bit confusing at first. What is this? What's going on? Then it hits you. A scene has never had me both worried and terrified quite like this scene has. You see the horrendous state Sakura is in. Then he appears, and all of his golden glory brings upon death. Except he seems to be the one on the receiving end. The lighting, OST, to the glitch effects on Sakura's body, the interpretation of Gil being absorbed in the shadow is a 10 out of 10 moment. Not to forget Sakura's complete transformation, with those creepy dancing shadows, solidifying all of our suspicions accompanied by the horrifying track in the background, makes an amazing cliffhanger ending. The last 30 minutes of Lost Butterfly are some of the best moments in Fate, in my personal opinion. In the visual novel, there isn't just one ending. As you move through the story and make choices, sometimes the choice you make can end up leading Shiro down the wrong path, or to his death. Usually all of the bad ends are cut out in most visual novel adaptations. Heaven's Feel alluded to the bad end, Mind of Steel, where Shiro refuses to abandon his ideals and kills the one closest to him. Fate Stay Night has many bad endings that add on to the world and its characters, and seeing these implemented into the anime is something I would like to see more of. You can't talk about the best parts of Fate without talking about its fights. While many of the fights in the visual novel were small, Ufotable went all out to make some of the best aesthetically pleasing fights in anime. Lancer vs. Assassin wasn't all that outlandish in the visual novel, but here it is one of the most fun fights to just sit back and enjoy. The animation, effects, beautiful soundtrack make every single fight that happens within these movies edge of your seat, fun, and memorable. Saber Ultra vs. Berserker is another top-notch fight with stunning visuals and soundtrack to boast it up. Watching it for the first time, I was in awe of how beautiful it looked. From the dynamic camera angles to the ridiculous amount of explosions, impending doom to the triumphant change in the music just made it so damn enjoyable. And if it keeps up this pace for the third movie, it will be the best of this trilogy. The soundtrack throughout these movies is one of my favorites. Composed by Yuki Kajira, who also did the soundtrack for shows like Fate Zero, Madoka Magica, Kara no Kyokai, and many others, the soundtrack adds an abundant amount of emotion to the overall story. The soundtrack perfectly helps set up the tone and gives much more impact to every scene. Whether it be emotional, terrifying, or an action-packed moment, the music manages to capture everything about that moment and enhance it. On the topic of music, the ending songs for both movies, Hana no Uta and I Beg You by Armor, are amazing through and through, and the lyrics of each song is pretty interesting when put in the perspective of Sakura. Last thing I want to touch on is the visual presentation. Not the animation itself, but things like movement and facial expressions of the characters. For example, Soken's crestworms. The erratic movement with the way they twitch as they move and the noises they make are chilling. The shadow also is terrifying with the slow pace it moves at, and the effects on its body with the sound it makes only adds to the terror it brings. The facial expressions and small additions to the environment contribute to more emotional impact. Take Sakura at the end of Presage Flower, for instance. If you look closely, you can see many footprints in the snow. There are also some close-up shots that show Sakura's frostbitten feet and hands, conveying how worried she was standing out in the cold, waiting. Shido's facial expressions when confronting his ideals or noticing Sakura's dark side is done to perfection. Without words, you can tell the pain he is going through. One of my favorite parts of these movies are the unique ways it conveys these feelings without having it told. From here on, I will be talking about the events that will happen in the third movie, which is day 14 onward in the visual novel. If you don't want to hear these things, I recommend skipping to the time shown on screen. I have no doubts that explanations for many of the things we will see in this third movie will be properly explained. This comes from the fact that in the Heaven's Feel route, there's a total of 16 days. The two movies were able to adapt to day 14. While these 2 days are probably the most content heavy, I have no doubt they will be able to explain things effectively. And while many explanations were cut from the previous movies, I believe they will use this chance to explain those things, such as Archer's arm, the Zelrek sword, and Zoken's crestworms. Now here are some individual scenes and moments that I hope are included and done to perfection. One thing I am worried about is that the ending won't have the same impact it did in the visual novel. This stems from Ilia's development throughout the anime series. People who have only watched the series don't have a lot of time with her. As she never is a proper heroine, the anime has to cut out a lot of her scenes to build up the main heroine of that route. And while this worked out for UVW and the 2006 version of Fate Stay Night, that can't be the case for Heaven's Feel. Originally, Fate Stay Night was supposed to have 4 routes, one for Saber, Rin, Sakura, and Ilia. However, due to time constraints, the Ilia route was scrapped and pieces of it were merged into Heaven's Feel, which I personally believe worked out for the better. So with Ilia's short amount of screen time, she needs quite a lot of moments to make the ending more impactful. Let's talk about where much of the focus will be, the top tier fights. This final third of Heaven's Feel has some of the most impactful fights in the series. Shido vs Berserker, Kide vs Zoken and Assassin, Rider and Shido against Saber, Rin vs Sakura, and finally Kide vs Shido. A plethora of fights that will look absolutely gorgeous thanks to Studio Ufotable. However, just because it's flashy, it won't give it the same impact that it has in the visual novel. Many of these fights have a lot of internal monologue with the combatants. Shido vs Berserker and Shido vs Kide is the most worrisome. These two battles have the impact they do thanks to the first-person perspective of Emiya Shido. Both of these fights showcase both the physical and mental damage Shido is doing to his body. Against Berserker, Shido is accessing something he has been told numerous times not to do. Doing so will not only put his life in danger, but if used incorrectly can destroy his very being. Every word used in his internal monologue is used to build up the danger and damage Shido is putting himself through. If any of the monologue is skipped over, it won't have nearly as much of an impact as it's supposed to. Against Kide, Shido is hanging on to life by a thread, and before him is Kide, in the exact position as he. This fight does well to show two men fighting to accomplish their objectives on the brink of death. As Shido fights, Archer's arm is producing the unlimited blade works inside of Shido's own body, having numerous swords impale him from the inside out. The first-person perspective easily allows us to know the pain Shido is feeling and what motivates him to endure this. Because the perspective the visual novel takes with these fights, I fear that some of the most impactful fights in the Fate series may not have the same impact when translated to the anime format, but only time will tell. I am extremely excited for this movie. The Heaven's Feel route is without a doubt my favorite time reading anything, so I hope the best for it. While I think making a movie trilogy wasn't the best choice for an expansive story like Heaven's Feel, the staff at Ufotable is doing the best they can with the time they have. But because of this pandemic, we probably won't see the movie come to the US theaters anytime soon, so I hope the Blu-rays come out as fast as possible.
Those were my thoughts on the Heaven's Feel movie trilogy. Let me know your thoughts, and feedback is always welcome. My next video will be a review of Tsukihime. Thanks for watching. Later.